You check your phone before you check on yourself. You compare your life to a highlight reel that isn't even real. You wonder, quietly, if you're behind. Behind in your career, behind in your faith, behind in becoming whoever you were supposed to be by now. But here's the strange part. The people history remembers as extraordinary didn't start that way. They started like you. Peter smelled like fish, not metaphorically, literally. His hands were cracked from rope burn, and his boat leaked more than it should have. He wasn't a rabbi. He wasn't a scholar. He hadn't studied under anyone important. He was, by every measure his culture used, unremarkable. And that's exactly the point. Think about how you imagine greatness forming. You probably picture some early sign, a gifted kid, a prodigy, someone who was always going to be someone. That's the story movies tell you, and it's the story your own doubts tell you too. If you were meant for something significant, wouldn't you already feel ready? But that's not how it happened for the 12 men who ended up changing the trajectory of human history. Matthew was a tax collector, which in his time didn't mean office worker, it meant collaborator. It meant traitor. Tax collectors worked for the occupying empire, skimming extra money off their own neighbors to keep for themselves. People didn't just dislike tax collectors, they despised them. Matthew would have eaten alone. He would have been the reason a room went quiet when he walked in. Simon the Zealot was, if his name is any indication, part of a group that wanted to violently overthrow Roman rule. James and John were fishermen too, the sons of Zebedee, hot-tempered enough that Jesus nicknamed them the sons of thunder. Thomas doubted almost everything, right up until the moment he couldn't anymore. And Judas, well, Judas becomes a cautionary tale, but at the start, nobody in that group looked at him and saw the ending either. None of them looked like the beginning of something world-changing. They looked like a random assortment of working-class men with tempers, doubts, criminal records, and no formal credentials. So why them? Here's where it gets interesting, and here's where the psychology and the theology start to overlap. Researchers who study talent and achievement, like psychologist Anders Ericsson, whose work on expertise shaped decades of thinking on this subject, found something counterintuitive. Early talent is a weak predictor of eventual mastery. What predicts it instead is sustained, deliberate engagement over time, often starting from an unremarkable baseline. In other words, the people who become exceptional rarely look exceptional at the starting line. They look ordinary, and then something happens in the years of practice, failure, and correction that the outside world never sees. The disciples weren't chosen because they showed early promise. They were chosen, and then the promise developed. That order matters more than it seems. Because if you flip that order in your head, you start believing you need to prove your potential before anyone, including God, would bother investing in you. You start thinking the invitation comes after the qualification. Prove yourself first, then you'll be chosen. But that's backwards from how it actually worked. Jesus walked up to fishermen mid-shift, men with no theological training, and said, essentially, "Come with me." Not, "Come with me once you're ready." Not, "Come with me once you understand." Just, "Come with me." The choosing came first, the becoming came after. Think about what that means for the version of you sitting here right now, wondering if you're doing enough, being enough, ready enough. You keep waiting for a feeling of readiness that almost never arrives before the moment it requires it. There's a psychological pattern researchers call the impostor phenomenon, first documented by psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes in the late 1970s. It describes high-achieving people who privately believe they don't actually deserve their position, that they've somehow fooled everyone around them, and that eventually they'll be exposed as inadequate. What's striking is that this feeling doesn't fade with success. It often intensifies. The more capable someone becomes, the more aware they are of everything they still don't know.
Peter probably felt this every single day. He denied even knowing Jesus 3 times, out loud, to strangers, at the exact moment loyalty mattered most. That's not a footnote in his story. That's the middle of it. And yet he's the one who ends up preaching to thousands, becoming, according to church tradition, one of the central figures in building the early church. The failure wasn't the end of his usefulness. It was somewhere in the middle of it. This is the part most retellings skip past too quickly. We like our heroes clean. We like the doubt and the denial and the mess to be a brief detour before the real story starts. But what if the mess isn't a detour? What if it's the actual material the story is built from? Consider how you think about your own setbacks. The time you said the wrong thing, the job you didn't get, the relationship you handled badly. Somewhere in you, there's probably a quiet belief that these moments are proof you're not who you're supposed to be. Proof you missed your window. Proof the person who was going to do something meaningful with their life would have handled it better. But look again at Matthew, a man whose entire profession was built on betraying his own people for personal gain. If anyone had a resume that disqualified them from spiritual significance, it was him. And yet he's the one credited with writing an entire account of Jesus' life, one that becomes foundational to billions of people's understanding of who Jesus was.
The disqualification you're worried about might be the exact texture of the story that's still being written. Here's another angle worth sitting with. None of the 12 auditioned for the role. They didn't submit a portfolio. They weren't interviewed. They were interrupted, pulled out of their actual ordinary day, fishing, collecting taxes, doing whatever forgettable task made up their forgettable Tuesday. And in the middle of that nothing special day, they were chosen for something they had no way of anticipating. You probably imagine your own significant moment arriving with some kind of warning, a sign, a feeling of destiny. But for almost everyone in this story, it arrived while they were doing something completely unrelated to greatness. It arrived in the middle of the mundane, which means the ordinary day you're living through right now, the one that doesn't feel like it's leading anywhere, might be exactly the kind of day this kind of thing tends to happen on. There's a reason this pattern shows up again and again throughout Scripture, not just with the 12. Moses was a fugitive shepherd hiding from a murder charge when he was called. David was the youngest of 8 brothers, so overlooked that his own father didn't think to bring him in from the field when the prophet Samuel came looking for a future king. Gideon described himself as the least in his family, from the weakest clan, before being asked to lead an army. The pattern isn't an accident. It's closer to a signature.
It suggests something almost provocative. Maybe the ordinary isn't an obstacle to being chosen. Maybe it's a prerequisite. Because ordinary people don't take credit the way exceptional people sometimes do. Ordinary people know they needed help. They remember what it felt like before, which means they carry the story differently, tell it more honestly, understand the people they're eventually meant to reach because they used to be exactly like them. If Peter had been a polished religious scholar from the start, would his eventual courage have meant the same thing? Or does it matter specifically that this is the same man who once sank while trying to walk on water, who once cut off a soldier's ear in a panic, who once swore he'd never turn his back on someone and then did exactly that within hours? His credibility isn't despite the failures, it's built out of them. So here's the question worth carrying with you after this ends. What if the thing disqualifying you in your own mind, the ordinary job, the past mistake, the lack of some credential you think you're supposed to have by now, isn't actually evidence that you've been overlooked? What if it's just what the beginning always looks like? You don't need to feel ready. Almost nobody in this story did. You just need to be willing to be interrupted in the middle of your ordinary Tuesday. Because the version of you sitting here right now, uncertain, unfinished, undramatic, might be closer to the beginning of something than you think. You checked your phone before you checked on yourself. Maybe it's time to check on the story you're actually in.